Hello, my friends. It's Bradley J. and the Bradley J. Show, and we're with Rich Rubino. We're going to talk about President Carter today and how he may not be as liberal a person as you, or liberal a president or a politician as you may have thought. And Rich is going to present us with some evidence there. How you doing, Rich?
Doing well, Bradley. Thanks so much for having me on again.
Rich Rubino is an author. He's an author of at least five books, politically oriented, but fun politically oriented. For example, his great American Trivia Challenge. Show the people your book.
Oh, yes.
There it is. It's really a cool book. How many trivia questions in there?
2,175, but who's counting?
Right. Can I just have at the end, we'll do a quick trivia question.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So, my friends, Jimmy Carter, as I understand it, is now in hospice care.
Yes.
He certainly had a long and very fruitful and constructive life in more than one sense of the word. He's generally thought to have been, well, it's my impression he's generally thought to have been a kind of failed president and a liberal president and kind of the poster child for liberalism among some. But you maintain that is not necessarily accurate, and he's more conservative than many believe. So
yes.
I'm going to just hand the floor to you. And if I have a question, I will ask it.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting. First of all, he comes from a relatively conservative state, Georgia. Of course, Georgia back then, the Republican Party was de minimis, very small Republican Party. So basically in Georgia, what you had is you had a progressive wing in the Republican Party and conservative bloodline. And when Jimmy Carter actually ran for governor in 1970, his main opponent was Carl Sanders. Carl Sanders was a former governor. Back then in Georgia, you could only serve one consecutive term. So Sanders served from 63 to 67. Then Lester Maddox, a very conservative governor, took over in 1967 and served for one term. Jimmy Carter ran to succeed Maddox in 1970 and basically said that Carl Sanders had sold out to the Hubert Humphrey liberal wing of the Democratic Party. That's basically what he said about Carl Sanders. He promised during that campaign that he would bring George Wallace, the conservative, or at least a socially conservative Alabama governor, former Alabama governor, to Georgia to deliver an address if he were to become governor. He only garnered 7% that year of the African American vote in the Democratic primary. Now, interestingly, secretly, he was actually telling African American leaders, "You may not like my campaign, but you like the way that I actually govern if I actually get elected." And he basically ran to the right. He gets elected as governor, and he also, by the way, said that he embraced Lester Maddox. Lester Maddox was a conservative segregationist. When Jimmy Carter ran, he basically said that he was very similar to Lester Maddox. So Lester Maddox had an interest because he had been governor. He was actually running for lieutenant governor. He could only serve one consecutive term. So Lester Maddox, the current governor, is now running for lieutenant governor. Jimmy Carter gets elected. Many believe that Carter is actually going to continue the policies of Maddox. Because up there in his inauguration address, and he basically denounces segregation. And everyone's saying, "Who is this guy? I thought this was somebody completely different." He actually appointed more African Americans to positions than any of his predecessors. So he basically kind of transmogrified, changed his ways in terms of segregation. But generally, what were his achievements as governor? Well, the main thing was actually a conservative reauthorization of basically truncating the federal agencies. At the time in Georgia, there were 300 federal agencies. He truncated that down to 33. That was his main achievement as governor of Georgia. So then, basically, timing is just about everything in American politics. There's nothing more important than timing. And Jimmy Carter was the candidate for president at the right time. He actually declared in 1974, right after the midterm elections. Interestingly, he got the Democratic Party to give him a special position where he would go around the country, recruiting people to run for office. And one of the people he recruited was Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, the story is, as I've told before, Jimmy Carter was in a hotel in Little Rock waiting for someone named William Clinton so that he could meet with him and try to recruit him to run for Congress. The guy didn't show up for an hour. Finally, he sees this guy who looks like he's about 28 years old, bushy hair. He thinks it's some sort of an aide. He says, "Where in the devil is this William Clinton?" And the guy says, "I am William Clinton." And of course, Bill Clinton was always known for being late. But so Jimmy Carter announces in late 1974, there was actually a poll in 74, a Harris poll, of the 35 top Democratic contenders for president. and you had Fred Harris, you had Hubert Humphrey, George Wallace. Jimmy Carter's name was literally not on that list. That's how obscure a person he was. So he basically goes out and he does retail politicking. The biggest advantage he has is that he's not an incumbent governor. He's not an incumbent. Other people that he's running against are either governors or they're senators, so they have full-time jobs. He can spend his entire time running for president. And he does that. His family runs for president basically with him. He competes in the Iowa caucuses, which were basically little known. He wins Iowa caucuses, and then he goes on and campaigns in New Hampshire. And this all basically benefited him because a lot of the other candidates he was running against, you had Mo Udall, congressman from Arizona, and an unreserved liberal. Tip O'Neill, the House Majority Leader, was out campaigning for Tip O'Neill. A lot of the liberal intelligentsia, campaigning that year from Mo Udall. You had Fred Harris, who talked about basically the precursor of Bernie Sanders, basically running as a populist that year. You had Birch Bayh running basically as a liberal. You had then you had George Wallace running socially to the right, and you had Henry Scoop Jackson, a senator from Washington, running to Carter's left on domestic policy, but running to his right on foreign policy. He was very much anti-Russian, very much a Cold Warrior. So Carter was kind of in the center right of that denomination. Eventually, Jimmy Carter starts winning primaries, and the Democratic Party does everything they possibly can to try to delegitimize him. So what comes to Florida, Jimmy Carter wins the Florida primary, wins 70% of the African-American vote in Florida, and defeats George Wallace. He upends George Wallace, proving that essentially another Southerner other than George Wallace can actually win Southern states. Now, all of a sudden, interestingly, on the Republican side, after George Wallace lost Florida and he essentially became dormant in the Democratic Party, Ronald Reagan is running on the Republican side against Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan is running ads in New Hampshire, running ads in different parts of the country, rather not so much New Hampshire, but in different parts of the country, where people would essentially come on and they would say, I'm a conservative Democrat. As much as I'd hate to admit it, George Wallace is not going to be nominated by the Democratic Party. Therefore, I'm supporting Ronald Reagan. So Reagan took advantage of that. And of course, Ford ends up basically upending him barely at the convention that year in 76, and Reagan wins again does win in 1980. But at any rate, so Jimmy Carter is basically a conservative candidate, and the liberal wing panics. So all of a sudden, Jerry Brown, who had just been elected governor of California in 1974, declares his candidacy. Frank Church, senator from Idaho, declares his candidacy on a Stop Carter movement. And they both run, and they basically end up losing. So Carter ends up winning the nomination. The Democratic Party doesn't know what to do, because this is somebody who's basically never been part of the Democratic establishment, someone who's a Southern Baptist, a moderate. But you know what Jimmy Carter does? He wins. He wins the presidency in part because he says, I'm untainted by Washington. Gerald Ford spent 25 years in the House of Representatives, been vice president, now president. He was seen as a creature of Washington, what Donald Trump today would call the swamp. This is right after Vietnam, right after Watergate, and then the Church Committee hearings, which ironically found that the United States had participated in coups in Guatemala and Iran in the 1950s. So basically, Washington was at its low ebb. The presidency was in its low ebb. No longer did we have the imperial presidency. Gerald Ford actually warned that the Congress was now essentially had more power than the United States president. So that's how Jimmy Carter basically won. And he partly won by being one of the more conservative candidates. He gets elected. By the way, and interestingly, I'll just have one more point about that. In 1972, when George McGovern, the senator from South Dakota, who was an unreserved liberal, won the nomination, Jimmy Carter started at the convention an anybody but McGovern movement. Interestingly, he actually delivered a speech for Scoop Jackson at the Democratic National Convention in Miami Beach, Florida, for Scoop Jackson, even though Scoop Jackson had already dropped out of the race and really had no chance. In part, he did that because he was doing that for his own political standing to show that he's a conservative alternative to McGovern. Then in 1976, the liberals form an anybody but Carter movement. So it's very ironic. Then Carter becomes president, and all of a sudden, liberals like folks like Tip O'Neill and Bob Byrd says, finally, we're going to get to continue Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, but we wanted the Vietnam with us. We want a Vietnam. We're going to be able to have more social programs. One of the first things they do, they propose water projects. Jimmy Carter vetoes it. Essentially, this is pork barrel type projects, earmarks that essentially would benefit Democratic politicians. He vetoes it, and he talks about balancing the budget and fiscal austerity. Not necessarily watchwords, if you will, for the Democratic Party. But that's when he starts talking about Democrats become alienated. He talks about reorganizing the federal government, which is not something Democrats want. Democrats want, national health insurance, which he kind of pays lip service to. But actually, Ted Kennedy proposed a more liberal version of health care. And Jimmy Carter later says that he thinks his health care plan probably could have passed had it not been for Ted Kennedy. So Jimmy Carter, in order to get much of his legislation through, forms a coalition of Republicans, center-right Republicans, with center-left Democrats, and actually does pretty well getting his energy proposal through, getting a proposal to preserve acres and acres in Alaska, in the Arctic, for example. He proposes a relatively small tax cut, and in 1980, he actually puts Paul Volcker in the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Paul Volcker supports tight money policy, which does not benefit Jimmy Carter in a presidential race, because tight money policy, while it might in long term, and it did, help to curb inflation, it also will curtail job growth, and that hurts Jimmy Carter when he ran for president in 1980. And interestingly, in 1980, the Democratic intelligentsia, the liberals, are at it again, going against Jimmy Carter. First, Ted Kennedy, the senator from Massachusetts, runs and basically says that Jimmy Carter is not a real Democrat. He has Carol O'Connor, who actually plays Archie Bunker, appearing in ads and saying that essentially Jimmy Carter is masquerading as a Democrat. And he says he's the worst economy since Herbert Hoover. He says that during one of his political ads. Then Jerry Brown, the governor of California, gets in the race, and basically they challenge that Jimmy Carter is too conservative. Jimmy Carter at one point was losing the race, and then all of a sudden the Iranian hostage crisis occurs. There's a rally around the flag effect in the United States. Jimmy Carter benefits from the Rose Garden strategy Gerald Ford had perfected at the beginning, basically saying, I'm not going to go out and campaign because there's so much to do here in Washington. So accordingly, Jimmy Carter, because of the Iranian hostage crisis, ironically lands up garnering the nomination, and Ted Kennedy reluctantly supports him, even though at the convention that year in New York, Jimmy Carter tries to hold up Ted Kennedy's hand. Ted Kennedy just kind of shakes his hand to show that there was still some friction between the two. And Jimmy Carter ends up losing, only winning 6 states that year to Ronald Reagan in 1980. Interestingly, though, there was one debate that year, and it was 1 week before the election. And you also had John Anderson, by the way, a congressman from Illinois, running as former Republican, running as an independent. And many liberals who supported Ted Kennedy and Jerry Brown went to John Anderson because they thought he was more liberal than Jimmy Carter was. Jimmy Carter was also somewhat culturally alien to many liberals because he was a Southern Baptist and a peanut farmer. He didn't necessarily fit the mold of a quote unquote contemporaneous at the time liberal. So Jimmy Carter has that one debate. In that one debate, Jimmy Carter goes out to Ronald Reagan, basically saying, you're going to truncate Medicare. And Ronald Reagan says, there you go again, basically showing that Ronald Reagan was not as threatening as Carter had made him out, and other Republicans had made him out in the primaries. So accordingly, Ronald Reagan lands up winning the presidency, and Jimmy Carter goes back to Georgia in what was probably one of the greatest ex-presidencies of American history. So that's basically my kind of synopsis of Jimmy Carter being more conservative, I think, than his story. History basically makes him, and part of that is because there are some conservatives, I've heard Sean Hannity do it, for example, who will make it today and basically say, well, the Democrats had this liberal Jimmy Carter, but I think if you went back to that time and you actually listened to what liberals were saying about Jimmy Carter, it was not complimentary. George McGovern, in fact, at one point said that I elected Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter won over Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter is essentially doing everything that Ford would be doing, to which Jimmy Carter responded, that's the thing with many people in the Democratic Party. You give them 95% and they complain about the 5% that they're not getting from you. So he would give it right back to the liberal bloodline of the Democratic Party. And interestingly, McGovern himself voted for Ford in 1976 without disclosing it. And he later said his entire family voted for Gerald Ford, to show kind of the distance between the McGovern wing and the Carter wing, if you will.
So history's not been kind to Jimmy Carter as in terms of judging his being president. Is that bad luck? Did he have bad luck, or was he not a great leader?
No, he did. He had a lot of bad luck. In part, there was the OPEC embargo, which he actually inherited from 1973. Which certainly was not good in terms of energy prices, certainly brought up inflation, but that certainly was not his fault. You also had a lot of spending from the Johnson and Nixon administrations on guns and butter, the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson and Vietnam. A lot of that ended up catching up first to Gerald Ford, then to Jimmy Carter. You had stagflation, which is not supposed to happen economically, which is essentially when both jobs are going down and inflation is increasing. Now, Paul Volcker in charge of the Fed actually had a lot to do with I think countering that inflation. And then by 1982, Ronald Reagan was getting a lot of credit for that. But another two things Jimmy Carter did from a conservative perspective. First of all, he deregulated the airline industry and the trucking industry. For basically conservative, talk about deregulation. And in 1980, actually, so Carter had basically continued Nixon and Ford's policy of détente. That's French for relaxation of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Then in 1980, when Russia invaded Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter changed. He had said when he ran for president, he's going to put more focus on Latin America than the U.S.-Russian relationship, and basically continuing a lot of Nixon and Ford's policy. When Russia invaded Afghanistan, Carter, first thing he decided he would boycott the Moscow Olympics, and he would put on a grain embargo, and he started increasing military spending, actually. And much of the military increased spending that Reagan gets credit for was actually began under Jimmy Carter's policies in 1980. But he actually does have a lot of achievements, certainly bringing Israel and Egypt together, bringing Sadat and Bacon together after about 14 days at Camp David. He persuaded them to have a peace treaty, and Egypt essentially recognized Israel. That was one of his major achievements. And I think bringing the Panama Canal Treaty, getting the Panama Canal Treaty, which Gerald Ford had actually supported and he had supported, was another of his major achievements. Now, in terms of his major failure, that was partly because, so Jimmy Carter campaigns in 76 on bringing human rights and making it part of the United States foreign policy. You know, the Church Committee had found the United States had perpetrated a coup in Iran against democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh, putting in the Shah in 1953. So Jimmy Carter basically did not put Iran on the list of those who were essentially state sponsors of terror, even though the Shah of Iran, certainly with his Sabat, with his secret police, was certainly oppressing anybody who tried to protest. You know, the police were beating people in the streets, everything else, but he turned a blind eye to the Shah. So in 1979, when there was a coup, and essentially the Ayatollah Khomeini came in to power and the Shah fled, the Shah ended up having cancer and wanted to come to the United States for medical treatment in Minnesota. And they went to Jimmy Carter, and Henry Kissinger, Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon all said, the Shah is an ally. We need to do whatever we can to essentially take care of his health. Jimmy Carter was reluctant at first, then he listened to his age, and he said, okay, we're going to do this. And this inflamed the Iranian people, in part because you brought the Shah in here, and they thought what we were going to do was we were going to try to install the Shah and put him back into power. So accordingly, they took over the embassy. The Iranian insurgents took over the embassy, took American hostages, and Carter could not essentially get the hostages freed until his very last day in office, when the Algiers Accord, negotiated by Warren Christopher, who later became the Secretary of State in the Clinton administration. But he did have some achievements. The Iranian hostage crisis was certainly his biggest failure, and that was certainly what I think permeated and overlooked the administration. And also just the feeling generally during the time period that the economy was essentially in the doldrums, and that was partly true because of the stagflation. What he called in 1980, though, I think it was basically tough love for the economy, because there was a lot of problems in 1981, but by 1982, the economy tended to be on better footing.
So presidents get blamed or credited for the economy much more than they have anything to do with. The economic forces take such a long time to have an effect. Things are happening now that were set in motion way before you, President, got there. And even then, the president doesn't have a whole lot to do with economic conditions other than setting either optimism or pessimism, I guess. Right?
Well, they do have what they can do, they can change the trajectory. For example, when Bill Clinton came in 1993, the Budget Discretionary Act, he basically changed the trajectory of the United States, and instead actually took on the liberal wing of his party as well, who wanted more stimulus spending, and basically proposed that there would be tax cuts on those making tax increase on those making over $200,000, which would go toward deficit reduction. That is largely credited with economic times during the 90s. Now, there are other factors as well. One of them was the tech boom, which Clinton probably had nothing to do with. And there was also the balanced budget in 97. I think bringing Gingrich in 1995, becoming Speaker of the House, and the two kind of working together probably helped. But I think that Budget Discretionary Act is something that gives a lot of credit for bringing the deficit down, help with the bondholders, gave them confidence. And then eventually the 1990s, you had the longest peacetime expansion in American history. I think that Ronald Reagan is largely giving credit for the economy in the 1980s. Of course, there's a same thing. There's a bunch of other factors. One of them being Paul Volcker in the Federal Reserve, but he's giving credit for the tax cuts. So that there are some people that will. I mean, I think the answer is it's like anything else. It's nuanced. The president certainly has an effect on the economy, but there are so many other factors. I mean, Martin Van Buren comes in 1837, and he has to essentially take over after Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson leaves, peace and prosperity. All of a sudden, there's a panic of 1837, in part because of some of Andrew Jackson's policies. Now, the question is always asked, how much does the president actually have to do with the economy? And my answer is probably it's limited, but the president certainly can. If the president can do certain things to stimulate growth, for example, you can bring the deficit down, you can bring interest rates down. Where you put the money, Ronald Reagan put money in the military, so obviously during that time, yeah.
Isn't it the Fed that brings interest rate down, and the president's really not supposed to mess with the Fed like Trump did?
Yeah, but the president is the person. Well, the president inherits the board of governors from their successor, and they inherit the Federal Reserve chairman from their successor. But when the Federal Reserve, when there's an opening in both the board of governors and when there is an opening in terms of the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the president can nominate that person, which is why Jimmy Carter gets credit for nominating Paul Volcker, who this is during an election year now. During an election year, Paul Volcker proposed tight money policies, which is not going to help the incumbent. Contrary to that, George H.W. Bush had Alan Greenspan, a Reagan appointee, at the Federal Reserve, and Alan Greenspan raised interest rates right around the time of the 92 election, which was one of the reasons why Bill Clinton defeated him in that election.
So back to Carter. Two things we didn't touch on. One is, boy, the Iranians must have really hated Jimmy Carter, because if I remember correctly, they purposely waited to release the hostages until the day of Reagan's inauguration, or thereby. They did that as an insult to Carter, correct? Because of his dealings with the Shah and all. And secondly, we didn't talk much about, if at all, the failed rescue attempt that ended up with the helicopters in the desert. Can you outline that? And it seemed, in my naive perception at the time, that was a pivotal thing that really put a nail in the coffin of the Carter presidency. Talk about that event and the events leading up to it.
Yeah. So basically, Jimmy Carter talked to his aide, and Cyrus Vance, was his Secretary of State, was completely against this and actually resigned his seat after this because he said we did not try to handle this militarily. Basically, there was a hostage. There was an attempt to rescue the hostages. It turned out there was a sandstorm, and essentially the helicopters, let's say, did not make it, and there were casualties. And it was a complete embarrassing. It was just like John F. Kennedy with the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the next day, Cyrus Vance resigns his seat, which is very rare for an incumbent cabinet member to actually resign their seat, but he did it essentially in protest. And Jimmy Carter was obviously embarrassed by this, but that was certainly his attempt to rescue the hostages. In terms of the Iranians hating Jimmy Carter, it wasn't that they hated Jimmy Carter per se. It was what they hated, the fact that Jimmy Carter, what they thought that he was essentially sheltering the Shah so that the Shah could go back in power. And they had seen this movie before, because in the Eisenhower administration, this is why it wasn't Jimmy Carter the person, it was more United States policy. In 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh was democratically elected. Imagine it's a democratically elected leader of Iran. Now, the Ayatollah Khomeini and all the Shia, most of the Shia Muslims hated him because they thought he was too secular, and a lot of them did not like the idea of essentially a secular nationalist leading Iran. But in politics, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So once the Shah took over, the Shah became the enemy. The Shah was also very secular, and they were very much opposed to the Shah. They said, we had a democratically elected leader, then the Shah, then essentially now we have somebody in power who is very much against the ideals of the ideals of Shia Islam. So accordingly, and because the people of Iran, many of them just absolutely had so much enmity to him because he very much oppressed his people. He was very much a despot. And by 1979, I think that with the fact that Jimmy Carter can even consider the idea of keeping him in the United States, now it could have been completely innocent. It could have only been because He literally wanted, from a humanitarian standpoint, someone has cancer, you want to save them. But they viewed it, no, they're keeping the United States because they're going to bring him back. And that's what precipitated and effectuated the entire hostage crisis, which probably saved Jimmy Carter's bid for the nomination, but certainly contributed to his loss of the presidency in 1980.
I always think of Iran as an oil-rich nation, but they weren't oil-rich. They weren't always oil-rich. That was a fairly recent development. What was it like there before that? And when was it that oil was discovered? Initially, it was British Petroleum, right? That went in there, and
yeah,
that whole oil thing factored in integrally to the politics there.
Yes, absolutely. Because what happened was, so what Iran did under Mohammad Mossadegh is he decided to nationalize the oil fields, as opposed to essentially giving British Petroleum and British Petroleum hegemony over. And Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, was inflamed by this, so he supported the coup. And all of a sudden, all this oil in Iran, he supported the coup for oil purposes. Essentially, said you can't nationalize it. We need some of this. He tried to persuade the Truman administration, the outgoing Truman administration, to go in on the coup with him, and Truman rebuffed him. Eisenhower comes in 1953, and Churchill basically persuades Eisenhower that this guy does nationalize the oil fields. We need this. We need this oil. We need this oil. We need the oil at cheap prices. We need to essentially support a coup, and we need to dislodge Mohammad Mossadegh and essentially put our guy in, and that guy is going to be the Shah of Iran. So accordingly, from 1953 to 1979, the Shah of Iran, who was unpopular with his own people and was seen very much as a Western-type leader, someone who, for example, on the positive side, was very liberalizing in terms of women's rights, for example, but he was basically hated by many of his people. They were insurrectionists. The insurrectionists essentially said, we're mad as hell and we can't take it anymore. And in 1979, it was that bringing the Shah into the United States, bringing him to Minnesota, which essentially began the unraveling of the Carter presidency. But that being said, Carter was still relatively unpopular even before the Iranian hostage crisis in his first 2 years in office, in part because there was an energy crisis, and he actually gave a speech. It was called the Malaise speech. He never used the term Malaise, but the newspaper reporter reported it as Malaise. But basically, he said that the United States needs moral uprising in the United States. And I think, generally speaking, when a leader comes on television and basically kind of excoriates the American people for their behavior, the American people don't just kind of listen and kind of nod their head. Usually, they'll say, who is this guy? Why is he essentially trying to bring us down? And that certainly contributed, as well as the stagflation, which he had inherited, to his downfall in the 1980 election.
All right. Have we covered Jimmy Carter? Do you want to get to the trivia? Or are there anything about Carter's legacy you want to tie up with a nice bow?
Yes, categorically. I think in terms of Jimmy Carter's legacy, the first thing you got to remember about his legacy is, and as I aforementioned, how important timing is in American politics. His candidacy would not have survived in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. People would say, this guy's a former one-term governor of Georgia, spent 4 years in the United States as a state senator in Georgia, very obscure. But it was because of those times that Jimmy Carter became a national figure, and because people wanted something other than what they were saying, other than a politician. Someone like people that were running against traditional Democrats, Scoop Jackson, Fred Harris, Mo Udall, Birch Bayh, Jerry Brown. Think of all these people. They all had more experience than Jimmy Carter did. Jimmy Carter won because of his lack of political experience. He had been a businessman. He became a multi-million-dollar peanut farmer. He had been a nuclear engineer. He was an Annapolis grad. So he had a lot of private sector experience, if you will. And then he essentially becomes a governor, but only serves for one term. People essentially say, this guy is one of us. We need to take a risk on someone who's completely outside of politics. He's only been to Washington a couple of times in his life, really. And so it was fascinating. If you look at where he was in 1974, literally 0%. He went to Iowa, he went to New Hampshire, he literally did retail politicking, where he would go and he would introduce himself. Hello, my name is Jimmy Carter and I'm running for president. One time he goes into a general store and the guy says, Jimmy who? Then they use that on his ads, Jimmy who. And then his convention speech that year in '76 goes up there. He says, "I'm Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president." So he made fun of his relative obscurity in America. And Gerald Ford essentially tried to make the case that year. Well, Jimmy Carter, he's not really ready to be president, but people wanted somebody that was just so outside of the system that Jimmy Carter landed up winning. And another thing I think is interesting about Jimmy Carter is you had the other thing that really hurt him was the Mariana boat lift. If you remember that year, Cuba, because of the United States policy of essentially letting refugees in, decided to the worst people in Cuba, all the prisoners, he essentially let them out and let them come to the United States, and many of them landed up in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. And you had a young governor named Bill Clinton, who would be the youngest governor in the country that year. All of a sudden, 125,000 or so refugees are coming in. They're all coming into Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and people are blaming Jimmy Carter for that. And surrogate, they're blaming Bill Clinton because Bill Clinton was a vociferous supporter of Jimmy Carter. So, partly because of Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton becomes the first former governor that becomes the youngest former governor in American history at just 34 years old. So you'd think two Southern governors would have a great relationship. They certainly didn't at that time, but later in life, when they both had their foundations, they really they really landed up working together. And Jimmy Carter was served as a former president longer than any other former president.
So that boat lift is the basis for the Scarface movie, right?
Yes.
Okay. And why did they end up in Arkansas?
Because they had room. There were other places. It wasn't only Arkansas.
They have room in Nevada too.
But that was one of the places that they sent him was certainly in Arkansas. And there was a guy named Frank White, relatively obscure, from the banking industry, runs that year against Bill Clinton. He's a Republican nominee. And a lot of people later said that they voted for Bill Clinton because they voted against him to teach him a lesson. They never thought he was actually going to lose that election. But you know what? He actually lost that election, and people were just absolutely awestruck by it. They just could not believe that. They were just many of his supporters were distraught. But there was another issue too that year. He also raised license plate fees, and if you live in rural Arkansas and you have to drive 2 hours to get to 2 hours to essentially pay it, and then you find out that was raised. That was another reason that Bill Clinton ended up losing that race. And interestingly, this was in 1980, right before the election, he got caught speeding. And this was right around the time also he was having a baby, Chelsea, and Hillary Clinton, and I know we're getting a little off tangent here, but anyway, Hillary Clinton that year, there was thoughts, why is Hillary Clinton going by Hillary Rodham, not by Hillary Clinton? Mm-hmm. So the question was, well, what are you going to name Chelsea? So Bill Clinton says, I'm going to name Chelsea Hot Rodham.
Okay. So thank you for this. Can we get some trivia? Can we wrap it up with some trivia from your fabulous political trivia book?
Yes. Let's see. Some trivia books. Here's one. Back in 1976, Jimmy Carter, I guess that's a Jimmy Carter question. Jimmy Carter's running for president. The Wisconsin Sentinel, that Milwaukee Sentinel that year, has a headline that says this person wins Wisconsin. Of course, he didn't win Wisconsin. It ended up being Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter ended up showing a newspaper that shows this guy wins Wisconsin. In reality, they didn't count the late night votes. The late night votes showed that Jimmy Carter actually won.
I should know that. Who is it?
Think Arizona. Big guy with a sense of humor.
Sense of humor. I don't want to be wrong and make a fool of myself. Big meaning physically big?
Physically tall, very tall.
In Arizona, I don't know.
Mo Udall.
Oh, geez,
remember him?
I know the name Morris Udall, but I would never have gotten that one. I don't feel so bad. All right, give me another one.
All right, here's one. In 1992, all the candidates were trying to get the support of this female Texas governor, and at one point, Paul Tsongas ran a political ad where he was swimming against the current. So he was literally trying to show his physical dexterity, if you will. So he's swimming and swimming and swimming. He said he swims against the tide. The next day, they asked this governor, they say, Paul Tsongas appeared in this political ad. Would you be more likely or less likely to support him, knowing after seeing him essentially with the shirt off swimming? And Ann Richards said, no, I would be less likely to support someone who looks better than me in a bathing suit.
Yeah, I'd say Ann Richards.
Yes.
Is it? Okay.
Ann Richards.
All right.
And who did Ann
That's
Richards?
one of the few things I know. It's interesting that I happen to know that.
And who did Ann Richards lose 2 years later? The governorship of Texas.
I give up.
George W. Bush.
Oh, all right. I didn't want to give my years wrong. Lola Pope got that pretty much right. Richard's
Oh,
son.
Ann
Close.
Richardson. Yes, Ann Richards. Ann Richards. Absolutely.
All right. Well, this is fun. This one didn't last as long as some, but
I'll give you one more. I'll give you one more from that campaign.
No, okay.
When this candidate suspended his candidacy, he said they asked him what the one thing you would do differently. And this is a Democrat running for president in 1992. What's the one thing you would do differently if you were to run for president again? He said, have Ross Perot adopt me.
Oh, I give up.
Think Massachusetts.
Running for president?
Yes. 92.
Song-
Songus, Paul
Yeah.
Songus. Remember that?
Yeah, so I got that one. I got that one right.
And you got Ann Richards, too.
Yeah. Paul Songus. Poor guy.
Paul
All right.
Songus. Yep.
Hold the book up because it's pretty cool. No, it's very cool. It's insane. And I can't read it. You got to tell us the name.
The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids.
Steroids.
By Rubino.
Thank you to Lola Pope, Lola Pope, for
Yes,
being so active. And thanks to Boston Bob as well. And even though it's cold out, I'm going to go out and walk because I feel stuck inside. So thank you very much, Rich Rubino, political historian and sometimes commentator. I know he doesn't like to get into the world of opinion too much, but sometimes I can egg him into it. I really appreciate it, as always.
Thank you so much for having me on again, and we'll do this again.
Okay, bye all.
Thank you so much.
You take care.